Underhanded competitive practices, corporate espionage, and even outright sabotage don't really sound like they'd be unheard of in the world of Fallout 4. In fact, in comparison to putting people underground and intentionally subjecting them to inhumane conditions, or poisoning them with a derivative of weapons compound, it's pretty tame. Today, we'll learn about how this was affecting one of the only other soft drinks competitors in the Commonwealth region, or at least close to the region. Today, we take a look at the Vim Pop Factory in Far Harbor, a location that, I have to admit, I'd completely forgotten about. A surprisingly detailed location, we get to learn about the inner workings of the company and their own quantum-like drink, in that it had a weird, though admittedly nowhere near as bad, ingredient with odd side effects. We'll also take a look at how the company was feeling, how everything was going wrong, and how we can actually prove, as I'll show, that it was outright sabotage. This all culminates in us taking a look at a hidden, unmarked location here on the island that gives us all of the proof we need. If you enjoy this longer form video and wish to continue to see more content like this, please leave a like and a comment, as it really helps out the video's performance, and subscribe so you don't miss future ones. Now, let's take a look at this place. When we first arrive, it's already crawling with super mutants who've taken over the whole place and barricaded the front and side entrances. The abandoned truck on the bridge was probably there before the bombs, and just never managed to make it into the factory proper, based on the direction it's pointing in. The hallmark of any super mutant compound, bloody cages and bags, can be found both above and around the main entrance. Just through it, we can see the large green sign that probably caught your eye when you first arrive. The slogan, "You've got Vim," was the original. We'll see later on that there was quite a bit of disagreement with the new slogan, which, while being a bit shit, led to the strange drink they came up with as a side effect. Past the sign, we can find some of their foodstuffs piled up next to what looked like, to me, makeshift grills. Which is kind of funny, as a lot of the abandoned houses have grills somewhere on the property, but maybe it was a size thing. There's one bloody skeleton, and it's very likely it's a recent one, unlike the two we'll look at in just a second, based on the blood. Past the entrance, on the right as you walk in, you can get to a guard station and find the first body that seems a likely candidate for a just post-war death. They're sprawled out in a chair, and from the location, I assume this was the guard that used to work here. If they had a grave, I'm sure they'd be spinning in it, knowing all these super mutants are trespassing on company property. Past them, on the right on top of one of the large pipes, we can find another skeleton. Now what this one was doing out here, I do not know. What we do learn later is that some employees were here when the bombs hit, so they could have heard the warning for bombs, vaulted the railing after emerging from the factory, and this was how far they managed to get. Great effort, poor execution. There isn't much else here. Both the parking garage and loading area have entrances to the factory and the corporate headquarters. However, we're going to go through this whole place in a certain order, so we'll ignore these for now. Heading inside the main entrance by the sign, we can see another part of the slogan, "Escape to Adventure." As some of the terminal entries will show later, this actually tested well. To me, it doesn't make any sense, but hey, it's a fictional soda in a fictional world. Through the shattered wall on the left, we get to a pretty gruesome sight with a fountain. Lots of bags of meat. To the left of that, we can find two skeletons that may have been the sources. Ignoring how they got all the meat off while keeping their clothes on for a second, I really hope these are post-war. If not, then someone who worked here murdered the guy on the right with a hammer. Might mean the work environment here was just a tad hostile. But again, the blood suggests they're recent. Opposite them, we take a look at the first litmus test of how mental a place is in most of the locations we look at. How strange the bathroom is. Now thankfully the most extreme thing we find is one teddy bear with glasses drowning another, or possibly robbing them, based on the gum and caps, so not too extreme. But fear not, we'll find worse things in other toilets here before we're through. The gift shop, apart from having some creepy looking mannequins and being partially on fire, is simply lovely. A great place to come and waste your money after the tour we'll be looking at was all over. Apart from the roof, a lot of the super mutants are gathered here and use this building, which was actually the corporate headquarters, for cover. It is here we find the first terminal we'll be taking a look at. It doesn't give us any of the weird information about what was going on here, like we'll see upstairs, but it does give us some background on Vim. The first entry gives us an overview of the presentation that takes place in the burned out theatre behind those two skeletons as we walked in. Unfortunately, we get no more information about it, apart from the name Reed, who was the founding family of Vim. The entry after this gives us an overview of the factory tour, which we'll learn about more as we read more terminals. Just keep in mind the part about the taste testing. The last two entries are notes on the tour itself. These help flesh out the history of Vim for us. The first of these tells us Vim is, at least when the bombs hit, 146 years old. I say when the bombs hit as the company doesn't exist anymore, so marking it from there seems reasonable. It was a health tonic originally, but to me that just seems like it was originally peddled as snake oil. I'm sure if you look at the history of many other soft drinks, you'd find a similar trend of outright lying to people and telling them it's healthy. The entry also has an outright lie in it. The deal to name it the state drink of Maine never actually went through, or at least was in the process of falling through, given the bad state the company was in at the time, as we'll see. The Reed family were the founders of the company, and still sit on the board with a large amount of the stock in their name, as entries upstairs will show us. Now this little bit right here, about this smaller building being a recreation of the one that burned down, I want you to remember that in the context of what we're going to learn later, as in my opinion, it could have been fucking arson. The last entry talks about how they get to see how the soda was made and test some new flavours. This features into the other story, apart from the Sabotage one here, about their new soda. They pretty much inflicted it on the tour-goers to see if they liked it or not. Now before we head upstairs, we can first take a look at the lower staircase. It has an entrance to the underground parking structure that we will not be using, but it also has another body. This time it's one that actually looks like it's from someone who worked here. It looks like the bombs took them out as they were taking these boxes outside. They managed to strike a very tragic, dramatic looking death pose, so they get extra points for that. Heading up the stairs we come across a few paintings. Now given our recent video on Vault 118, I can't help but wonder if these weren't created by Santiago Alvida, the resident painter there, or at least mass-produced pre-war ones. That is, if he was even telling the truth about how successful his art was. Once we get to the top of the stairs, we come to the headquarters of Vim, and we can start to piece together what was happening here just before the bombs hit. The room of cubicles we find at the top of the stairs is in pretty bad shape, with one of them just collapsing into the gift shop below. However, before we take a look at them, I want to take a look at the kitchen. Here, we can find at least one pre-war skeleton, maybe two. I'm not entirely sure about the one on the table here. Yes, they are missing the characteristic blood smears that many of the skeletons present here, but were the result of the super mutants, have. But the gore present here suggests this room was in use, so it's odd they remained undisturbed all this time. However, the lunchbox here contains a bottle of Nuka Cola, so they could have been murdered for their disloyalty to Vim before the war, and left here as a warning to others. The other body is this poor fuck. They died on a toilet, eating a can of beans. A much worse sight than those two teddies downstairs. Bit strange they decided to eat on the toilet, if I'm honest. I mean, there was literally a break room right beside them. Back inside the cubicle area, we can find the body of a woman inside one, just to the right of the break room as you leave. No way to tell who she was, but likely the bombs falling got her. Opposite, we come to another terminal, and it's here that the story of this place really begins to take off. This was the terminal of Madison Young, who worked with the finances and accounting of the company. The first entry is called Schedule, and it shockingly tells us her schedule. This entry kind of gives the cliff notes for all the strange goings on we'll come across here. We learn that hazard pay is to be issued, though we don't know for what yet. We learn that there were talks of some sort being held with the Nuka Cola Corporation, which directly influenced much of what went on here. We learn that there was a bar brawl, and that Madison wanted the recipe for the Captain's Blend to be released by someone called Iris. The initials AC are mentioned twice as well. We'll be addressing everything else first, so for now, just keep those initials in mind, as it will be important later on. The entry after this is the quarterly earnings report, and it's looking really bad. If I'm reading this correctly, they had lost over $3 million for that quarter, but it's actually a lot worse than that. The start date is October 1st, 2077, so presumably this was to be the quarterly report for October, November and December, and, just as the previous entry stated, was going to be updated continuously. But the bombs dropped on the 23rd, which means that in just over 3 weeks, they'd lost over $3 million. This gives you an idea of just how bad the company was doing at the time, but keep in mind that the greatest costs, after taxes, were marketing, distribution, and repairs. All of these, as we shall see, were being negatively affected during this period of time. The next batch of entries are all found under the internal meal relay. This is something that crops up on several terminals throughout the factory. I will present them as we come across them, but keep in mind that certain entries could have taken place before ones that we will have already looked at. The first one is from a Doyle Reed, titled How Dare You? Madison had apparently been instructed by the investors to schedule meetings with Vernon Conroy at Nuka Cola. Doyle is incredibly opposed to this and reminds her that his family are still the majority stockholders, and he, the CEO, he threatens her with termination if she goes behind his back again. I'm not sure if that would stick, to be honest, as the CEO does have a legal responsibility to listen to the shareholders. I'm not sure how much legal right they have to give Madison orders or tasks, but clearly she felt that they did. This is our first indication of tension between the two companies, and it only gets worse. The next entry is from Iris Mason, titled Too Soon to Start Production. We don't know who Iris is just yet, but she seems to have control over the recipe for Captain's Blend, so R&D of some sort is a reasonable guess. Apparently Madison wants the recipe, and for production to begin immediately, and she contacted someone called Leroy in production to get it done. Iris says they have more taste testing to do, and Doyle promised it wouldn't be rushed out to market. She finished by saying that they can't have this one feel, which seems to be in reference to the dire financial straits the company is in. Why Madison is doing this is a bit of a mystery, but it will become clear soon. Based on the response, this was probably before Madison added to her schedule to get Iris to release the recipe, as by this point she hadn't been denied yet. The final entry is from a Willis Rudd, and shit is getting a little real. He is complaining the company's claiming that there is no hazard pay. Hazard pay for what, you might ask? Well, apparently their trucks are being hit. Yeah, you heard me. The employees seem to think someone is targeting the trucks, and if 3 of them have been hit, I've got to agree. Who or why is unknown, but it seems to be the trucks that are delivering the Vim, so it must be related to disrupting the distribution in some way. How bad the employees have been injured remains to be seen, but the employees seem to think it's dangerous enough that they warrant more pay. So there's definitely a lot going on behind the scenes here. Financial troubles, the competition circling like sharks, possible issues with a new recipe, and someone may be directly targeting the company. You might even already have some idea of who it is. Spoiler, you're almost certainly right. The next room is looking worse than the previous, with even more of the floor having collapsed. We don't get anything in the way of terminal entries here, but if we head into what looks like the boardroom next to it, we can find another one. This one being the terminal of Norman Fuller. And this time the terminal tells us he works in marketing and promotion. The first set of entries are in the internal mail relay. The first is from Doyle Reed, titled That's Great News. It seems to have happened after the bar fight that was referenced in Madison's terminal entries. Apparently the governor was going to drop Vin from becoming the state beverage because of it, but Norman managed to convince her to wait until the case was done. Now I understand why this would be the case, due to the optics, but punishing an entire company because of one worker who, as we shall see, is almost certainly innocent is a bit over the top. Moreover, there was a war going on at the time. You'd think people would have more important things to worry about. The next entry is from Madison saying that they have to delay the TV ads due to a lack of funds. This is due to the court case, investments falling through, and repairs to trucks and machinery. That last part is likely why the budget showed the repairs and distribution being so high. The damage to machinery, trucks, and the effect on the shipments were all piling up. She says either he does it, or she'll have to go over his head and get Doyle to do it. Based on the massive amount of money they were still spending on marketing, I have to wonder if he ever did cancel them in the end. The entry after this is where we put on our tinfoil hats. Willis Rudd says that Alex, the man involved in the bar fight, is being framed. Also, he apparently decked a woman, which explains why the governor probably thought this was worse than an ordinary fight, though I disagree. Willis says Alex was just getting a beer when the woman punched him out of nowhere, and he hit her on reflex. Now, given the setting of the pre-Fallout world being modelled on 1950s, 1960s America, it's reasonable to assume there are parallels between the attitude towards women there and in our world in that time frame. Due to this, people probably didn't look favourably on Alex hitting the woman. Now, in my opinion, in the spirit of equality, if she walked up to a stranger and punched them in the head, which is extremely dangerous, with no provocation on their part, she deserved to get the same back. She doesn't get to turn around and claim they can't hit her because they have a physical advantage. She should have thought about that before she broke the law and assaulted them. This does leave the question though, if the witnesses are telling the truth, why did she do it? Well, we'll just have to keep exploring to find that out, but I wouldn't feel too bad for her if I were you. The final entry is fucking hilarious. It's from Iris Mason, and it's titled The Taste of Maine. We learn that Iris does indeed work in R&D. We also learn that she's not best pleased at Norman due to his vague requirements for their new drink. This entry must also be quite old, as the drink was finished by the time the bombs were dropped, or at least had a limited release. She talks about cramming a bunch of fish and wildlife into the bottle to meet the taste requirement. This is funny, as this is exactly what she ends up doing, and it leads to something incredible, as we shall soon see. The next set of entries are marketing plans, all presumably created by Norman. The first is in reference to the Vim Ambassador program, or at least how badly it's going. It started out well, but this program seems to have been the victim in the same way that distribution was. Someone stole one of the power armor suits off of a truck. This is what the Vim Ambassadors were. individuals going around in power armor and giving out Vim. Alex was apparently one of them as well. Now, the hit in the eye he took was apparently bad enough he had to go to hospital over it, which it seemed to imply he got more than a black eye from it. The witnesses all agree she assaulted him, but she apparently told reporters that he grabbed her. This being a better angle for the story, and perhaps with some bribery, it's the story the news is running with, so it's reflecting badly on the company in general. The next is titled Escape to Adventure, and details the recent slogan of the same name they had. It's apparently playing very well with consumers. However, due to the constraints and the marketing budget, they haven't been able to cast somebody for the role. This explains why it's only a drawing for their character, as opposed to an actual person, in the case of Nuka Cola. I'm still not a huge fan of the slogan though, but I guess it was working. The final entry is again in regards to the Captain's Blend, and it's done far better than anyone assumed it would. The number one term used to describe it is fishy, but despite this, people seem to be reacting favourably to it. Doyle wanted to hold off on the rollout, but they convinced him to try a regional one, presumably confined to only the island. This explains why it's present here at all. Also, keep in mind the fishy taste of the Captain's Blend. Leaving the boardroom, if that is what it actually was, we can enter Doyle Reed's, the CEO's, office. Here we get yet another terminal to help us fill in even more of the backstory of this place. Oddly enough, there's no body here, which is strange given the first entry we find. On his terminal, this first entry is titled It's Happened. The bombs have fallen and the sirens are going off. He says he's locked himself in the office and his body is nowhere to be found. He expresses confusion in regards to the purpose of targeting the island. Apparently, he hears an explosion outside, which is just poor timing. We may actually get an explanation of this in the unmarked location we'll be taking a look at, but more on that later. He finishes by saying that he has to get out of here, which answers the question of why his body isn't here. Now, where he actually ended up, I have no idea. The second entry is titled Meeting with Investors. This seems to be after he told Madison never to schedule meetings behind his back. He confirms that it is an attempted takeover. He also mentions how they lost the trademark on quartz, which explains how there's another cola of the same name. I think this means they released theirs first and somehow they lost it in court. He seems to have a lot of faith in the Captain's Blend, yet despite the desperation, he isn't just throwing it on the market, like what happened with Quantum. He wants to get it right, showing his management style is very different than Bradburton's. I assume that it, and becoming Meehan's official drink, were what he felt would allow him to compete on a larger scale. Next is his internal meal relay, and the first one is from Madison Young, informing Doyle that the investors decided to reach out to Conroy themselves. This seems to be in reference to the meeting with Conroy that Doyle found out about and blamed Madison for. Apparently the investors were already talking to him, and it was either deal with him directly, or the investors would just sell their shares to him anyway. Either way, Doyle would have to deal with Conroy, so I think Madison made the right move here. Of course, the only reason they wanted to meet with him was the financial troubles of the past year, which works out very well for Conroy. It puts the issues the company's been having in a new light. Next up is a message from Willis Rudd, detailing the attacks that have been occurring on the staff. Doyle seems to believe that it's all coincidence, and to be honest, I find it very hard to see how he can think this now that we actually get told what's happening. How in the why blue fuck is a series of shootings on your trucks that directly affect distribution a coincidence? Either this kind of thing would have to have been very common, or Doyle is in outright denial. The comment about machine technicians is also interesting, as again, it tells us why the repair costs were so great. Out of the norm repairs and equipment were being required, which would suggest an intention behind the damage and malfunctions. Willis ends by saying the staff could start to quit. I assume it never got this far, as a lot of this seems to have occurred shortly before the bombs dropped. The second last entry is from Iris Mason regarding the Captain's Blend, and she still thinks it's weird everyone actually likes it, which just adds to the mystery of what's really in it. She's still hesitant to tell people, which suggests that whatever it is quite non-standard for an ingredient. If you remember her entry ranting about the taste of Meehan, and some of the things she suggested they throw in a bottle, I'm sure you can put it together. At least Doyle listened to her about limited release and more testing, kind of a polar opposite with what occurred with Kate Levitt and Quantum. The final entry is again from Madison, and Conroy has yet again made another offer for a buyout of what seems to be Doyle's controlling interest in the company, and likely the other investors as well. Additionally, to make sure Doyle didn't just ignore him again, he sent copies of these offers to the other investors, ensuring that they had to at least respond to it, the shrewd bastard. She says their finances have been in bad shape for years now, which suggests that even before all the recent goings-on, they still had a lot of trouble making a profit. All of this may have only started to occur because they were on the verge of becoming the state drink, and releasing a new flavour that was testing very well. Personally, given what we know, I think working under their umbrella would be awful. Now it's time to take a look at the factory proper. There are a few entrances, but we'll start with the one that leads to the upper walkways first. Immediately we can see that the walkways have collapsed, meaning the only real route is to drop down below. Back towards the other entrance, we can find a lovely display of love that Vim has for their friendly competitor. Probably some envy as well, given they actually had a real casting for their mascot. Heading down the back of the room, past everything that is still on fire, we have two options: up the stairs or down a ramp. We'll take a look down the ramp first, where we can find the conveyor belt that transported bottles of Vim from the bottling section of the plant. Following it around the corner, here we can also find one of the more interesting things in the factory: a super mutant behemoth, or more specifically the corpse of one, when we're done with it anyway. This is all in the flooded section of the factory, and following it will bring you to the end of the factory, letting you skip a lot of the rooms here, but we won't be doing that. This behemoth is actually called Grun, and is locked inside what seems to be a loading bay at the back of this room. We can find a little about why this happened on this terminal now, and a lot more about it later. On the terminal, we can find a single entry. It says that Grun, the behemoth, had been locked inside by the author of the entry, and it wouldn't be a great idea to let him out. Fairly sound advice, to be honest. Didn't stop us though. It will soon be clear who this is, and it's actually quite surprising. There's not really anything else to be found here in the flooded section, so we'll be heading back up the ramp and heading upstairs into what looks like a staff break area, or a kitchen. No strange deaths in the toilets this time around, just a single bowl, some cereal, and a pot of coffee set out that looks just a little too civilized for the average super mutant to have done. Then again, as we'll see, there actually was one of a degree of sophistication that could be responsible for this. Heading out the door at the back of the kitchen, we come to what looks like one of the rooms where the Vim was brewed. As we'll see later on, the vats where it was actually mixed. Fairly standard room, rubbish thrown around, bags of human meat cooking over trash can fires. Standard stuff. At the back under the stairs, however, we do find two very odd skeletons. What looks like two men who died holding on to a bottle of Vim they appear to be fighting over. I say this because one of them pulled a knife and likely used it too. Now who these two were, I don't know. I think it's more likely these two deaths were sometime after the bombs than before. I can't think of any reason why two people would get into a fight over a bottle of Vim pre-war, unless this workplace and/or tour group were more hardcore than we know. However, if they are post-war, that doesn't really explain how they both died clutching it, unless both of them somehow got wounded. To the left of those two, through a door, we hit gold again. A skeleton with its head beside its body, holding some mentats. The machine says, "Caution, this machine has no brain, so use your own." My theory is this person thought to themselves, well, mine's not great either, and decided to take some mentats to compensate. Doesn't seem to have helped out in the end, as, you know, they're dead. But you can't think your way out of every problem. Heading back into the room we just came out of, we can head up the stairs to the next level, and start to find out more information about this tour and factory, and most importantly, more bodies. The first of which is right here, sprawled on this table. Again, we cannot be certain it's an employee, but based on the lunchbox and share, I don't think it's an unreasonable conclusion. Behind them, by the Protectron, we can find the terminal of Willis Rudd. The number on the tour notes terminal gives you a rough idea of the route they would take, but we won't be looking at them in that order. This part of the tour happens after they come through the tasting area. This entry confirms the previous room was where the mixed Vim was brewed, apparently in the same manner its creator Herbert Reed made the health tonic he sold. Now they state that while being fermented, it is non-alcoholic, but since this was also how Herbert did it, and presumably with less advanced equipment and legal restrictions, I have to wonder if his original health tonic wasn't just an alcoholic drink. Next is the internal meal relay, and it has Doyle's response to Willis saying Alex was framed. Doyle believes him. Additionally, we learn that Willis is an old-timer, old enough to be Doyle's father, given his kids went to school with Doyle. He says he'll get the bail money for Alex. This puts the terminal entries not only after Alex was hospitalized, but after he was released and subsequently charged for assault by the police. Honestly, up until this point I'd assumed it was a civil case, as so many witnesses supporting Alex's report of being the victim would, in my mind, at the very least mean he wouldn't be charged, even if the woman wasn't. After this is another entry regarding hazard pay, this one Madison's response to the one Willis sent her. She thinks he's blowing it out of proportion, and it's just bad luck. Again, just to remind you, people have been shot at. She does make somewhat of a valid point. A larger employer will always have more crime associated with it. I think there might be another explanation, however, for her blasé response to this. I think she could be being manipulated into thinking this is all a coincidence, or is outright lying and knows it's all actually intentional. This is due to the meetings on her terminal where she mentioned an AC. It will be clear by the end who exactly this is. The final entry is a memo from Willis to the other workers in distribution and manufacturing, the ones who have either been assaulted or noticed issues with equipment. They've come to the conclusion that there is a pattern to all these actions, and they intend to make plans to deal with it. If this was the Friday just before the bombs hit, then they never got the chance to implement their plans. If it wasn't, then they never seem to have gotten around to doing anything about it by the time the world ended. If we head through the doors just opposite the skeleton on the table, we can come to the room mentioned a few times in entries now. The taste test room is included as part of the tour as well, likely so that they could get as many opportunities to test their new formulas on consumers. It's likely they also have another team to do so as well, outside of those just taking the tour. We can find all the available flavours of Vim here, though there isn't much else to see, apart from yet another terminal to help fill in more of the blanks here. On the terminal, it has notes 4 and 9, as this is one of the first places you pass through in the tour, and then return to at the end. The 4th note states this outright, meaning they'd only briefly passed through here after walking through the now collapsed overlook we saw at the very beginning of the tour. The 9th note says that the previous stop before here was the Vim Ambassador section, where the power armor was prepared before being sent out. This entry shows that they were still trying to get feedback for the captain's blend, as it was given as a sample to all who came this far in the tour. Given that they were still working on it right up until the bombs fell, this makes perfect sense. The entry after tells the tour guides how to instruct those in the tour to sample the drinks. The part about putting them in different pitchers seems a bit redundant, as a lot of the flavours came in either different colours and or gave off a glow in a different colour. All this information about the rating system culminates in the final entry, simply titled Notes. It states that the response to the captain's blend has been great, despite everyone saying it literally tastes fishy, gives you a clue as to what's actually in it. Even weirder, apparently it's been giving people strange smelling sweat that has been likened to a pear. This is the first time we outright get told that there's something off about the captain's blend. This, together with the random way it's been put together, and Iris's reluctance to share the recipe, tells us that something is indeed quite fishy about this drink. Heading back through the room with the skeleton again, we can head up the stairs to the doors past them, and come to the Vim Ambassador room. This is where, as mentioned, suits of power armor were prepared for employees to venture out in it and distribute Vim. These were the same suits that were being stolen off of trucks. More information about this is provided to us in the terminal entries present here. The first entry on it gives an overview of the program. Certain staff members will get into these suits and go out around the island handing out one of the 3 flavours, Vim, Vim Refresh, and Vim Quartz. Alex was likely made one of these ambassadors as he'd have the training to use suits of power armor. This is something that Fallout 4 usually ignored, but the previous games were pretty consistent with, stating that special training, usually reserved pre-war for military personnel, was needed to correctly operate power armor. Turn Note 8 puts this part just before the taste testing, but after the bottling section. It seems to imply, given how small Far Harbor was, that this program of sending ambassadors was meant to extend beyond the island, likely part of the plan for competing on a larger scale that Doyle referred to. However, the suits that were stolen on the island itself, not off of it. Exiting the ambassador section and heading down the stairs and across the walkway to the right takes us towards the mixing station, where we can find the vats where the actual soda was flavoured and mixed, before it was taken to the vats to be fermented. This is likely the last holdout of super mutants you will encounter, save for the roof. This is the area that would be directly after the fermentation section, but before the bottling, ambassador program and the taste testing. The first entry here details the mixing process. Nothing to suspect here apart from the claim about pure main spring water. I'm not saying this is an outright lie, as this company does seem to be somewhat on the level. I just wonder if they don't cut some corners. The ones after this are very strange, and relate back to the one regarding Grun being locked up. The first is titled, What is this place? It's from someone who came to the island, at the time of writing, a few weeks before, and apparently they feel different now, calmer. They attribute this to either the Vim, which I assume they've been drinking, or the fog, which seems more likely. However, it seems to have had the opposite effect on those they came with, and it's made them more violent than before. Entry 2 is titled Why Are We Doing This? Whoever this group is, they are taking out the harbourmen of the island, and Grun is insisting on this. They attempted to bring this up, but they are threatened with death if they act like a weak human. Given that this implies they aren't, and that the factory has a large amount of super mutants, it's clear they were too. The final entry takes place just before they lock up Grun. Using this as a last distraction, they plan to leave, counting on the fact that the other super mutants are thick as pig shit and won't be able to figure out how to let Grun out. Even if they do, he'll just attack them all. Who this individual is, however, is a story for another day. We do encounter them, however, on Far Harbour in the wreckage of a plane, if you'd like to take a look in the meantime. So at some point, presumably quite recently, the super mutants set up here, and eventually one of them decided they didn't want to live a life of brutality and violence anymore, and left. As we know since we let him out, the other super mutants never did manage to get Grun out of the basement. However, I have to wonder what the cause for the change was. I think the fog is far more likely, as the Vim here, as far as we know, isn't a witch's brew of nuclear material and diluted weapons-grade compounds. You know, like quantum was. So an interesting topic for another day could be to take a look at the fog, as super mutants are certainly not the only creatures we encounter that are altered by it. The area after this is found between the two vats. However, despite a large amount of gore in the room, we can find no terminal with notes or other information. From the look of it, it seems to have been destroyed, going off the busted one attached to the wall. Now the next thing to look at would generally be the basement area we can find in this very room. However, I'm first going to go up on the roof and cover what's there first, and then come back down here. Outside, we'll start from the area overlooking the garage and work our way inwards from there. Just outside these walkways, we can find another body sprawled over a cabinet and exposed to the elements. Hard to place whether this death was just after the bombs or a long time after. If it was just after, then it's odd they have no clothing, given the one behind them, on the pipe, does. This is the one I drew attention to earlier. I still thank them for an employee that just vaulted the railings and was in the process of fleeing the chaos here, either sabotage related or from the bombs. Going back into the walkways, we pass quite a lot of gore left over by the super mutants posted up on top of the building. There's a few other entrances to the roof, several from inside the factory it's situated on, but I think this route is the easiest one to take to cover it all. The roof is caved in from the next floor up of this structure, and from here we can head to the left, across another walkway, to the opposite side of the lower area of the roof. Here we can find a few interesting things. The first is behind this yellow piece of equipment, directly opposite the walkway. Underneath it, we can find another employee. Based on the hard hat, they seem to have been working out here on this equipment, and then they died when the bombs hit. Either that, or they hid under here for some reason, and died some other way. The former seems more likely to me than the latter, as I can't think of what could have killed them, as they are most certainly an employee. It could have possibly been related to the Saboteur we'll look at, but it's not likely. Heading to the right of this body, we can go to the far end of the roof and find a pair of skeletons unceremoniously shoved into a bin. Despite their appearance, I don't think these are very old. Unless this company was far more cutthroat than it appears, it's unlikely these belong to anybody working here. Likely just bodies of super mutant victims, or bodies they decided to actually clean up. Heading back to the point where we originally turned left at, we can progress up a staircase to get to the other area of interest here that contains the final set of terminal entries in the factory. This area is the R&D section of Vim that has come up several times in the terminal entries we've looked at here. It is here that Iris Mason created the Captain's Blend that started out, in my opinion, as a passive-aggressive response to the request from Norman Fuller. The terminal here has two sections, user logs and the ever-present internal mail relay. The first of the user logs is actually her own thoughts on that very request. Again, she believes that it's a nonsense statement that doesn't really clarify anything about the desired product. You could argue that her job is to take these vague requests and turn them into something tangible, but I would argue that being able to concisely state your requirements in the first place would make the whole process a lot smoother. The next entry is titled "It's Actually Not Terrible." She literally just grabbed a bunch of ingredients related to Maine and fishing and bucked them in with some classic Vim, and it seems to have worked. It's not revolting. This was the point where it started being introduced to the tour-goers so they could nail the flavour. The third entry is titled "So This Is Really Happening," and Iris seems to be at a bit of a loss that they're actually going to try and release this as a drink. It tasted fishy even at this point, and I mean, I can't really see how they're going to completely cover that up, even with the extracts that she's talking about. The name doesn't seem to have changed either once they came up with the Captain's Blend. The best is saved for the last entry. If you recall, some of the feedback in the tasting was that the sweat of some people who drank it smelled weird, like a pier. Iris states this isn't surprising, given the volume of lobster present. What is surprising is that apparently, fishermen are reporting that lobsters are less prone to attack them once they've drank it. Given the weird smelling sweat, it's reasonable to conclude one is related to the other. Now why this is the case, I've no idea, as eating lobster doesn't help you blend in with them. So this could be a hint that something much stranger was present in the Vim, possibly lending some credibility to the theory that it was affecting the aggression of the super mutants. However, I think it's literally the added lobster. and my reasoning is the volume of extract present, as mentioned by Iris, but we need to read on to learn more. The first entry of the internal meal relay is from Doyle Reed, in response to her message to him about Norman's request being mental. Fair play to the man, he seems to think it is as well, and just asks her to take a stab at it and see what comes up. Again, it seems like he had a pretty good relationship with most of his workers pre-war. Now this last entry is about the expense reports, and it's from Madison. Apparently Iris spent about 10 grand at a fish market. Given what we know of what is in the captain's blend, I think it's a safe bet this was her buying up ingredients. However, 10,000 is a ridiculous amount just for some ingredients, especially when it's only a test soda. Given this, and her comment about the amount of lobster in the drink, I think we have our answer. I think Iris bought a huge amount of lobster to extract whatever it was that is making the drink actually taste good, but at the same time, it's so concentrated it's actually making people smell like lobsters, or at least give off something that makes the lobsters consider people non-threatening. This likely explains her reluctance to release the formula, and why she thought no one would believe her. Because cramming 10 grand worth of lobsters into a soda is fucking insane. Now I've got to wonder if these costs would even make the drink financially feasible. They did produce enough of it for a limited release, which is where I assume the cost came into it, as there's no way it could cost that much per bottle. If that were the case, the price would have to be far higher, so either she managed to get the cost down for future batches, or this was the reason she didn't want them pushing it out, that even if it sold well, they'd still be in the red. But even if that was the case, they could have rebranded. No longer a soft drink, but a tonic to aid fishing by enchanting, or I guess one could say catfishing, the lobsters. Now that we've dealt with all of that, it's time to take a look at some post-war shenanigans, before we finally look at the sabotage that went on here. Now before we head down these elevators, I just want to clarify something. What's down here leads into a quest involved in DiMA's story. To that end, we'll not be going into the full detail, or even all of what is found here, especially regarding a certain AI. I'll just be covering the bodies and the holotape, as well as providing some context. If that isn't what you want, then skip ahead to the next section. As soon as we enter, we are immediately greeted with the sight of a gunned-down body, illuminated by some glowing fungus. I say gunned down due to the bullet holes. However, for some reason the only blood is to the right of the body, whereas you'd think it would be on the wall behind them. Additionally, it appears that whoever shot them did so from the stairs we just ascended. Directly beneath those stairs is another body, and this one doesn't seem to have put up much, if any, of a fight. So they were either a coward or they died in their sleep. It seems harsh, but the other person would have died first, in my opinion. So the only way they would have been caught out is if they were asleep. Now apart from them, the only other thing we can find here, body-wise, is the exhumed one inside this coffin. On the body we can find Avery's skull and locket, which pretty much tells you all you need to know about the owner of the body. This is obviously confusing as Avery's alive, right? Well, as it turns out, we can also get a holotape down here, and it pretty much spells it all out for you, but we'll get to that. Further in, past the console of a certain AI we'll talk about in another video, we can find a room with a lot of medical instruments in it, and it looks like a horror show. There's multiple gurneys here, and all of them have blood splashed around, or on them. Whatever was being done here was pretty gruesome. I also don't think any of this was pre-war, as we'll find out later DiMA was using this as his own medical laboratory. If you thought this was related to the body we found, you'd be right, and we can take a look at the holotape we find in here to get a better picture. The tape is titled, "What's Done is Done."
Is it going to be painful?
Yes. It's going to be like having everything you are ripped out and replaced with something else. Someone else.
I'm ready. I wish I could say goodbye to everyone.
No one else can know. This isn't just about infiltrating Far Harbor. It's about becoming the human that synths drawn here need to meet. Reasonable. Willing to accept them as just another living thing. No greater or lesser than humanity itself. You'll be part of the bridge between our two worlds. That all vanishes the moment anyone discovers that it's been manufactured. That you're a synth.
Did she have to die? The woman I'm replacing? God, she looks so peaceful lying there.
Don't. Please. That blood is on my hands, not yours.
So yeah, I feel like for a lot of people this was one of the moments when DiMA's character went from a good to a bad in their books. Avery, the woman we all meet for the first time in Far Harbor when we arrive, is a synth, put there by DiMA after killing the original, so that a figure sympathetic and tolerant of synths in a position of authority is present in Far Harbor. He killed her and disposed of her body here, then he used this medical facility to manufacture a synth that looked just like her. We don't know who the other Harbor woman was, beyond being a synth. At some point he lost control of this facility when the super mutants moved in. It's possible they are responsible for the deaths of the 2 individuals down here, or perhaps these were other people from Far Harbor, as they are clearly not synths. We'll have to see if future information in other parts of the story tells us more. For now, I'll leave it as is until we get into the rest of the story of Far Harbor. Now to unveil the identity of the saboteur behind all the issues, at least the recent ones, that we saw at Vim. If you take the road directly west from the factory and continue along it, you'll come to a fuel station. Around the back of it is a set of basement doors that give us access to the lair of the Saboteur. Presumably it was chosen both due to its proximity to the factory and the roads the delivery trucks would likely have to take. Upon entering this basement, called the Armory, we come to quite a sophisticated setup. Along the left wall is a weapons workbench, and directly opposite it is a large amount of weaponry, including a missile launcher, which will be relevant soon. They've got some targets set up next to them in a makeshift shooting range. Along the back wall is a bank of computers and a chem station with some Vim on it. Captain's Blend, in fact. Along with this is a large barrel of Vim, almost as if they needed large quantities for the chem station, like they're trying to analyze or reproduce it. Well, this is exactly what they were doing, as we shall see right now by taking a look at the terminal. So this was the terminal of Aubrey Copland, who I assume is a woman, going off of the name. You might have noticed their initials, AC, the AC that Madison stated she was meeting in her schedule. This could either mean she was in on it, or being manipulated, but we'll have to keep reading to find out more. The first set of entries are under Plan of Attack and come in 3 phases. Phase 1 talks about the small ways they can disrupt things, putting up signs that give the appearance of faulty vending machines and swapping out tainted bottles, though that last one seems very extreme to me. Tainted with what, exactly? They will do this until they can identify other things to exploit. The last part states they're going to make contact with Madison to start working internally. Now it doesn't say manipulate or exploit, it says make contact, which could imply that Madison was aware of what Aubrey's goals were. Phase 2 is when the workers started being targeted with attacks. The goal was to affect profits and rile up the workers, and as we saw, this is exactly what happened. They were in the process of taking action themselves, and as the earning report showed, the costs of repairs and distribution were becoming a real issue. It ends with them stating that Madison was going to point out losses to the board and provide them with a list of investors. This confirms that she was outright working with Aubrey. This puts every action she's taken in a whole new light. Now it doesn't mention the bar fight in the terminals, but I just can't believe, given the unprovoked nature and the damage it had in the company, that it wasn't a setup. Surely it had to be part of Phase 1 or 2. We never get told who the woman is, but I doubt it was Aubrey. That would put her too much in the spotlight, and if someone's seen her with Madison, it could ruin everything. Phase 3 is an excellent example of Madison's betrayal as well, where her insistence of getting the recipe from Iris was also due to her instructions from Aubrey. This also explains why they've got some down here by the chem station, as they're trying to recreate it themselves, though they aren't having any luck. Not surprising given that lobster isn't exactly a common ingredient for a soda. They finish by saying they just have to keep the pressure on until someone sells, which, given the last entry about offers to investors, was probably inevitable. The last set of entries are the user logs, the first being, I actually like bowling. The message suggests that Madison actually has feelings for Aubrey, and that they may have been reciprocated, but we don't have enough to be sure. Moreover, they say they can use it to their advantage, so hardly particularly romantic. After this is an entry regarding the Vim Ambassador program. Aubrey was indeed the one who stole one of the suits. Given she shot at the tires and knocked out a driver, I don't know how everyone wasn't convinced they were being targeted. She implies she was prepared to do more if the driver had made it difficult, which, along with their comment about using the relationship with Madison to their advantage, makes them sound pretty cold, to be honest. This is backed up by the last entry, which hilariously explains the explosion that Doyle heard. Aubrey hit the factory with a missile launcher, looking to mask it with the attack that they assumed was a false alarm. Now, since the missile launcher is still here, that suggests to me that they attacked successfully, and then they left this bunker when they realized it wasn't a false alarm. It makes sense, as the world is ending. Who cares about their job? I don't know if they survived, as I couldn't find their body. Alternatively, there was a spare missile launcher, and they attacked the factory, and then died somewhere near it in the explosion. So this was the tragic tale of the final days of Vim, the would-be official state drink of Maine and primary competitor to Nuka Cola in the region. Due to this competition, Nuka Cola sent in Aubrey Copland to begin sabotaging the company from without, while Madison Young worked from within. This started small, with them making vending machines appear to be out of order, all the way to shooting up the trucks and assaulting the drivers, all to run them out of business. Eventually, however, due to Norman Fuller coming up with a crap slogan, a new flavour was born. The Captain's Blend, which was comprised of lobster to such an extent it fooled other lobsters into thinking humans were lobsters. Again, this seems like a wasted opportunity to get in on the ground floor of the emerging market of crustacean deception lotions. Because of how well it was testing, Aubrey needed to get their hands on it. When Iris refused to hand the recipe over or push it out for full distribution, they tried to reverse engineer it, to no success. Around this time, Alex was assaulted by some woman in a bar, then took the blame for the whole thing. As we've discussed, this was almost certainly planned by Aubrey, given both the timing and the effect it had on the company. These attacks, and Madison whispering in the ears of the board, resulted in meetings with Vernon Conroy that likely would have led to a hostile takeover of the company. There's still a chance that Madison was completely ignorant of all of this, but I really don't see how they could have been manipulated into doing so much and not realize that. Aubrey's work culminated in attacking the factory with a missile launcher when the sirens went off, indicating the bombs had been launched. I'm not sure what their plan was if this was a false alarm, as this would have definitely started a full-scale investigation by the authorities, as, you know, a missile strike's pretty hard to cover up. Sometime later, DiMA set up a medical lab here in order to conduct any, let's say, alterations for now, on the people of Far Harbor or the synths here. All of that is a story for another time that we'll have to take our time covering. After this, some super mutants eventually arrived at the island and decided to take over the factory as a base of operations. Either due to the effects of the fog or the Vim, one of them began to change, questioning the violent acts of their other super mutants. They eventually left, locking up the behemoth Grun in a section of the basement and leaving a warning for all who would come after, i.e. us. We'll cover the individual, like DiMA, in another video. All that was left was for us to arrive and begin clearing out the place. As we did, we pieced together the tragic tale we have covered today. A tale of one of the few companies that tried to compete with Nuka Cola. The saddest thing is, despite all that was visited upon them by Aubrey, if the bombs hadn't dropped, if the world hadn't ended, they might have come out of all of this stronger, ready to compete with the company that tried so very hard to destroy them.